Hello, it's Dr. Darnise, and welcome back into another episode of Dr. Darnise's House of Magic, Religion, and Conjure. Welcome, everybody. I have some news. One, I am going to do a teaching on the Black Church here, but I want to let everybody know that I am hearing that people want to do the class with me on African American religions. So that's good. So I'm planning that. But in the meantime, I've decided to add a Patreon page. So someone has asked me very specifically about Patreon and how he could support. So I have put together a Patreon page, and I'm going to put that link in the description box. And so feel free to wander over there. There are some free things that are readily available now. And you'll see the different tiers, and so what you would get if you sign up for one of those memberships. So, having said that, welcome, and as always, I appreciate your liking, sharing, subscribing, all that good stuff. So let's hop into this topic. I was teaching this past week in my class about whether or not the Black church is dead, and that already sounds very controversial for a lot of people. Maybe not so much us on this channel watching this kind of material. We might say, yeah, it's been there for a long time. That's why so many of us are leaving. But I mean, from another point of view, and this is not my own, I have to say, it's not my own original idea that the Black church is dead. As a matter of fact, it's not my idea at all. But I mean to say that there's a scholar out of Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University, Dr. Eddie Glaude, and he said back in 2010 that the Black church is dead. He's an African American religion scholar, and this set off, as you can imagine, all kind of ripples throughout the community of Black religion scholars, and people were up in arms. What does this mean? You're trying to throw away our whole tradition. This is how we got over since slavery. All of our leadership has come from the church. Or at least religious leadership, so it was quite the to-do, right? And so then he clarified what he meant when he said the Black church is dead. What he meant was, and that's, again, 2010, he made this statement. And so he was really talking about since right around 1980s forward, that the Black church now is missing its prophetic voice. All right, so what does that mean? The prophetic voice is the one that speaks truth to power. The prophetic voice is the one that goes before the halls of power, the institutions, the government, the banks, the corporations, and says, hey, you are not treating the needs of the people as holy anymore, or if you ever were. You are letting the chase for money dominate everything, and people are suffering under your watch. What are you going to do about it? So that's the prophetic voice, right? And that goes back to the concept of the prophets from the Bible, from the Judeo-Christian Bible, right? Each of those prophets was someone who was raised up by the divine to go and speak on behalf of justice and on behalf of the people. So that person, typically, they didn't volunteer for this, right? Nobody wanted to be a prophet because you recognize the danger that you're in. The society is always going to come for you if you are that prophetic voice, right? You're going to be, at the very least, maligned. You're going to be, harassed. You're going to be disparaged, your reputation smeared. Used to be, you would be imprisoned, you would be killed for speaking against the government, for speaking against the powerful people in the society. One might say that still happens. You might be cut off from your employment, somebody like Colin Kaepernick, right? You might be unable to make a living in the way that you used to because the institution will always come for you and tell you to be quiet. Because of course, they're invested in the status quo. Because they're succeeding in it, right? They're making all the money, they're holding all the power. The last thing they want is for somebody to come along and say, you're doing something wrong and stop doing it. So anyway, that's the prophetic, right? Prophetic activism. And we think about the black church from before it was such a thing as a church, but black Christianity, even if we go back to the plantation, what purpose did it serve, right? It gave people, much as we might have issue with it. And those of us on this channel, we're like, we have issue with it. Much as we might have issue with it, it did serve a positive purpose in various pockets of our history. And so African people being given Christianity still managed to turn it around into something that propelled us into our own leadership, right? And our own community formation. So Eddie Glaude in 2010 says that's not what's happening anymore. We don't have a Dr. King anymore. We don't have a Malcolm X anymore, who's not a Christian minister, but a Muslim minister. We don't have strong leadership from Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton. And have they been co-opted? We could argue that. Have they been co-opted, and that's why we don't hear their voices so much anymore? Who has emerged who, as a minister or someone doing ministry kind of work, spiritual activism, who has emerged within this thing that grew to be the black church, who's still speaking truth to power on behalf of black people, right? The common person. And so Eddie Glaude, specifically pointed to the prosperity preachers on television, the prosperity gospel, to say that that is what has ruined or killed off the black church, right? So he's like, the prosperity ministry has killed off the prophetic activism of the black minister. Because the black minister had two roles, at least two roles back on the plantation, right? That was to bring the gospel, the master's gospel message to the black people, right? Slaves, be obedient to your masters, don't steal, don't lie. And he knew he had to do that while the white people were looking. But his other role was to be prophetic when they would have their own secret meetings. He knew that his role was uplift of the people and to give them what they needed to survive enslavement, to survive this brutal system, right? And so it was at least two jobs that minister understood he needed to be doing. So fast forward to let's just say the 1980s forward to the present moment. Are our most prominent black ministers doing that? Are they still in that role of presenting the needs of the people as holy? Or have they gotten so enwrapped in capitalism that they can no longer critique it because they're getting a check, right? And when I say getting a check, I mean they have huge churches, huge congregations. Their primary mode is to be a CEO and to grow their church as a business and to do whatever is necessary to make as much money as possible. Now, we could talk about what the prosperity gospel is, and I will do that in another teaching. But just to sum it up, right, you are probably familiar with it already, right? People call it name it and claim it. Send your money, plant a seed with this amount of money, and God will bless you with more money, right? So ministers like Creflo Dollar, to some extent T.D. Jakes, Joel Osteen gets thrown in there. He's not a black minister, but he gets thrown in there. And I have to kind of disagree with that to some degree about Joel Osteen, because if you notice, Joel Osteen never asked for money. Think about that. Again, I'll go into more detail in another video. You can ask your questions in the comment section there. But the kind of ministers that I'm talking about, the ones who seem to always have their hand out. Creflo Dollar got into a lot of trouble in the last few years because he went before his congregation and asked for a second jet, right? I mean, he already has a jet. He already has a couple mansions. He already has luxury cars, but he felt like his wife needed one too, so that they could spread the gospel better, I guess. Anyway, so this was in the news. I would say maybe, has it even been a couple years? But within the couple years, this has been brought up again because somebody in the some people in the congregation got really mad and put it on social media, and it blew up. How dare he ask us for money for a second jet in the name of God? So that's the prosperity gospel, right? So Eddie Glaude says, hey, that means the black church has lost its prophetic activism. It is now bedfellows with the halls of power. It's invested in keeping this thing called called capitalism, right? And so it can't possibly go and speak to governments and corporations and banks about things like, um, predatory lending or lack of health care. You can't now. You're taking a check. So in that regard, I've added my own voice to that to say, yeah, the black church as we knew it might well be on life support. But then in class, I like to give some examples of some people who are doing that prophetic activism. And so, it's not to say that there are not any churches anywhere in America, any black churches anywhere in America who are not being prophetic, because there are. There are individual ones, right? And they're smaller, they don't get a lot of attention. And because of that, we don't know who they are necessarily. So this thing called the black church, that big monolithic idea of this being sort of a singular community identifier, the black church, we don't have it there. We don't have that activism there. But many of you maybe have heard of Reverend William Barber. He's on television a lot these days. He has a church, Greenleaf, in North Carolina. And he's definitely out there on a public stage now speaking truth to power because he's decided to take up the cause of poor people. He sees himself in the, following in the footsteps of Dr. King. So we know that Dr. King, towards the end of his life, was really talking about poor people and the rights of poor people. And some would say that's absolutely that, and criticizing the Vietnam War. Those are the things that got him assassinated, more so than his, speaking on behalf of black people in particular. But once you start talking to poor people and uniting poor people against the power structure, now we have a problem, right? And you need to go, because you're going to unite poor people. They're going to begin to set aside their issues about race because they see a bigger picture now, right? So Reverend Dr. Barber, to these days, is someone who is very active in speaking truth to power. And so you could, if you've never heard of him, I suggest you Google him. Again, it's William Barber. And the second example would be Father Michael Pfleger, who is in Chicago. He's a Catholic priest. It's an African-American Catholic church. Michael Pfleger is not himself black. He is a white man, and he has been in this role of activism, though, on behalf of black people and poor people for decades. And so even though he is himself not black, I have to say that he is in the prophetic role of serving a black church and a black community, and he's dedicated his life to those things. So I'll put both of their names in the description box here in case you want to Google, especially my Reverend Father Pfleger, because his name is spelled kind of unusually. But I would ask you, what do you think in terms of the black church? Because we think of the black church as being dead as something like black people don't want Christianity anymore. And there is that, right? Here we are, and we talk about other forms of spirituality other than Christianity. So there is that. And we have to say, we're more interested in recovering our own indigenous spiritual practices. But there are those who would remain Christian. We know that. Obviously, there are those black people who would remain Christian. But if they're going to remain Christian, how can that church be better? How can it actually serve black people? And if it doesn't, is it true to say that the black church is indeed dead and it has been supplanted by capitalism and the lure of it, right? Because we are all it's a drug, right? We could talk about it all day long. We could critique capitalism, but we are ingrained in a system that teaches us to get rich or die trying. I always tell my students this: capitalism is a system that makes us all want to get rich or die trying, and it makes us believe we can, especially if you're in the middle class. If you're poor, you're like, no, I'm not going to get rich in this lifetime. But if you're middle class, you tend to think, oh, I can just work hard and invest and buy property, and then well, not so much anymore. I've also been seeing this meme go around social media. Capitalism is a Ponzi scheme. It makes us all think that we're going to get that, but at a certain point you realize only certain few people are going to get that at the top, and the rest of us are worker bees and expendable. So anyway, this is like an economic and class analysis that gets added into the idea of how religion is functioning in Black communities or not functioning in Black communities. What do we expect our religious leadership to do? Do we expect them to just stay in the churches and tend to our souls? I don't think so. As Black people, as African American people, that's never been what our Black experience, our Black religious experience has been. It's never been singular. We've always needed our Black church and Black religious leaders to do more than just deliver a sermon, right? We've needed them to be community leaders. And if we don't have that, if they are not stepping into the role of community leaders, what does that now mean? And here's something else I'll ask too. At what point do leaders from the more, we might say, marginal spiritualities, such as African practitioners of African traditional religions, at what point do they step into public leadership? Are we still so marginal in terms of our alternative spiritualities that we cannot really, or we are still hesitant to step into the sphere of community and even political leadership? Who's going to be that leader who rises up and says, yeah, I practice Vodun, I practice Santeria, I practice Ifa, I practice Hoodoo? Somebody going to do that? Somebody going to be that new age guru? All right, so I think I'm going to leave it there. Video is kind of long this time around, but I really would like your comments about whether or not the Black church is dead. And is it dead because nobody is really breathing life into it? You know, my students are college age, so they're 18 to 22 roughly. And they're very hungry, like I say on here regularly. They're very hungry, so they get very involved in this conversation. Because even though they are not going to church, they're hungry for a spirituality. And so they've already decided that mostly church is not for them. But some of them are still plugged in. Some of them still want the church to be more. And so we have these kind of conversations, and some of them get excited, like, oh, that means that young people can really come in and infuse it, like give it life support, or give it a, what do you call that? I'm blanking on the term. Mouth to mouth. You know, can you resuscitate the Black church if younger people come in with their energy and creativity and, you know, give it some life back into it? Is that possible? Again, so I'm just going to give you a reminder about Patreon. Go on over to Patreon. The link will be there in the description box for you. And see the free stuff and see the different tiers that are available. I'll always have at least a few free videos there, but I would hope that you would think that you would consider joining. And also stay tuned for when I get into the class, because that's going to come up here. I don't know, I can't really say when, but keep in mind that I'm going to do that African American religious class. And those are the kind of things that we talk about, right? Like we talk about these alternative kind of spiritualities, but we also talk about the leaders of different traditions that maybe you haven't ever even heard of. And that's important, but for talking about African American spirituality, it's not all the same. We're not all the same, right? You get some history, you get some culture, you get some well, a lot of religion, obviously, you get a lot of the context out of which we have created our various spiritualities and survived this thing called white supremacy in the U.S. So that's it. All right. Thank you for subscribing, share, all that. Click the bell so you know when I make another video and upload. And that is all. Bye for now.